So I'm Jim Grilliot. I'm a field representative for the laboratory. I live and work down in south central Kansas, near Wichita, a little town of Heston. Been with the company for 17 and a half years now. Previously in ag retail for nine and a half years.
Jim Fasching. I've been a representative with Midwest Labs up in the Minnesota, Wisconsin, sometimes covering Dakotas, Michigan, northern part of the country since 1998, so coming up on 22 years. Prior to that, about 17 years as a crop consultant in southern and southeast Minnesota. Live in Plainview, Minnesota, which is just northeast of Rochester, about 20 miles or so.
I can start with phosphorus, Jim, and then if you want to take potassium, and then we can finish with nitrogen, nitrate.
That works.
So when we look at phosphorus on the soil test report, we want to be looking at that Bray1 value to start with, or P1, as it shows there. Bray1 is an extraction method that we use. It's a weak acid, and that value does not represent actual phosphorus. It represents a guide to available phosphorus. So what that means is there's actually excellent correlation calibration to fertilizer applications with this extraction method. So in other words, if we're at a 16 or 11, as you see here, parts per million P1, we have a pretty good idea if we're going to get a response from a certain amount of fertilizer. So to explain P1 again, it's a guide to available phosphorus. There's a second value there, Bray2 or P2, and that would represent a part of available plus a part of reserve. So ideally, we'd like to be at a 25 parts per million P1. We'd like to be at a 50 P2. That P2 extraction is a stronger acid. It's 4 times as strong, so we expect it to be twice as high. So again, if our target is 25 P1, we want a 50 P2. Why would we want to do this second extraction like this? A couple of different reasons. One, it's a QC measure, and what I mean by that is if we have a P2 that comes across that is higher than P1, we know something's wrong there and we're going to rerun that. So it's a QC measure. It also gives us an indication of just what type of soil we have. I mentioned we want a 1-to-2 ratio between the two. Again, 25-50. If we've got a ratio that's wider than that, 1-to-3 or maybe 1-to-8, would indicate possibly we've got some tie-up. For example, I see a lot of P1s in the upper single digits to maybe lower teens, and P2s upwards of 100. So when you see a ratio like that, what that's telling us is we've got plenty of phosphorus in that soil, but it's being tied up most generally by calcium. These are high pH soils, generally high calcium, and we get some antagonism going on there. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you get low pH acid soils, and you can run into some other antagonisms. A lot of times you'll see a 1-to-1 ratio. Sometimes it'll be a low rating for both. What that is telling us is we've got a pretty poor fertilizer history of phosphorus. A lot of times we'll have medium to high, maybe very high, but still a 1-to-1 ratio. What that would tell you is over the years, phosphorus has been applied, P2O5 has been applied, but because of that acid soil, it's not being taken up by the plant. And we continue to get year after year, as phosphorus is being applied, we just continue to build that up. And while it's available, the plant can't take it up because of that acid soil. So there's a third extraction method on there, the Olsen bicarbonate, and that is again another extraction method that we use in high pH soils. It can be set at the pH that you desire. Most generally it's 7.3 and above, and we'll run that Olsen bicarb. It's a better test for high pH soils. Better represents what the plant can take up at high pHs. The ratings are a little different on that. Again, when we look at a P1 value and a target, we're looking at 25 as the target. And on an Olson, if we're in the neighborhood of the mid to upper teens, we're in pretty good shape. Whenever an Olson bicarbonate P extraction is run, that is the value that is used in our equations. Fasching, go ahead. And feel free to add to that anything on the phosphorus if you'd like.
I thought you covered the phosphorus pretty well, Jim. I really have nothing that I would add other than on occasion to enforce maybe a little bit the reason you want to run that Olson on a high pH soil is occasionally up here in Minnesota, we have enough excess calcium carbonate in fields that we can even affect the P2 reading and drop that down into the low single digits, whereas the Olson value gives us the number we are really truly looking for to make a recommendation. I don't know how often that happens, but occasionally it happens on some of our western Minnesota soils, especially in the high pH areas.
I actually have seen that as well on some soils down here. Not often, but it does happen, yeah.
All right, on potassium, as listed on our report, we're doing a neutral ammonium acetate extraction, and the terminology to use is exchangeable versus available. What that means is the K is attached to the potassium is attached to the exchange sites in the soil profile, usually the clay exchange sites. It doesn't really hold on readily to any of the exchange sites that you might see in your organic matter, and moves off into soil water as the plant takes that nutrient up. Now it's a little bit influenced by, and maybe more so by, the cation exchange capacity than some of the other elements, in that when we see CECs that trend higher and are indicative of a higher clay content in the soil profile, what we would consider a high potassium reading might be considered a very high potassium reading on a soil with a CEC in the mid to upper teens. What that means is some of that potassium is lodged or locked in between the clay layers in those exchange sites, and really can't move out into the soil solution without maybe a little bit of additional help. And sometimes we see that help coming from some of the applied acidic fertilizers we put out there, like a nitrogen or a sulfur. One of the other aspects on potassium that we look at a little bit more closely is what percentage of that potassium is present in the base saturation. I think that's an area that we have covered in past discussions. But ideally, if you look at the Midwest Laboratories guidelines, we'd like to see our percent saturation of potassium on K be somewhere in the range of 3 to 5% on a soil report for optimum availability for a crop on any given soil type in any given year. So it can be a little bit more of a challenge on a high cation exchange capacity soil to build that K-test level up to achieve that. Whereas on a soil type like a loamy sand or a sandy loam, or even a sand type with a very low CEC, an application of lower amounts of potassium can bring that up, that percent saturation level up a little bit faster and a little bit quicker. But it also, in those types of situations, potassium can also become a mobile element, which I've seen on soil types or lighter soil types around here, almost to the point that rather than try to make a build type application on those light soils, it's just something you should probably apply annually every year. And we want to keep, regardless of what the saturation level says on those light sandy soils, you would want to keep your potassium right at around 100 parts per million, or just a little bit higher than that. Can be influenced by a soil pH, like nutrient uptake of a lot of elements. And I have seen that where potassium on lower pH soils, that value can actually go up a little bit as we add limestone to those fields and improve the pH. The calcium and or magnesium in the agricultural limestone, as it attaches to those exchange sites, can sometimes kick some of that potassium that's been locked in there off of those exchange sites and put them in the soil solution. And we can pick that measurement up every once in a while. As far as our equations go on potassium, I think we're in a pretty good shape. Maybe, there's been some discussion about raising those a little bit to match up with the higher yield potentials that we're seeing agronomically in corn and even in soybeans. For the most part, from what I get from feedback from my clients, the potassium values work pretty well. There are always going to be thought processes from your agronomic crop consultants and retailers and what they see out in the field. But for the most part, our potassium guidelines are pretty good, as long as you kind of correlate them a little bit with what your soil's cation exchange capacity is.
I think it's important to understand as we look at nitrate on the lower left portion of the report, that when we think about available nitrogen, it is just nitrate that we're seeing there and not ammonium. So if there is a situation where you need to understand exactly what is available out there, make sure you request the ammonia test as well. But as we look at this nitrate, these values on here, we see parts per million on the left, and then we have a pounds per acre, and then a depth. So what we're doing is we're multiplying the parts per million times 0.3, which is a factor we use, and then multiply that by the depth in inches. And that gives us our total pounds per acre. Jim, anything you'd like to add to the nitrate test there?
About the only thing that I would add on those, a lot of times on those 0 to 6 inch samples, the nitrate is there, but if we get a good rain event in our area, we're pretty certain that those values have been moving or are moved down into the soil profile, so that it may not be reflected as well as it should. So that's why we're seeing more deeper nitrate sampling, down to 12, 24, 18 inches, just to try to get a better handle on it as we look to manage our nitrogen levels better. But no, other than that, I have nothing in addition to add.
I would say too, and that got me to thinking about this. I've seen some reports lately that have shown some extremely elevated levels of nitrate, levels that the retailer or grower would not have expected. And the sulfur just happened to be analyzed as well, and there was elevated readings there. And when you see something like this, it really it makes you wonder what's going on, and possibility of some compaction, some significant compaction going on. Because any kind of element that will move in the soil should move in the soil, and you wouldn't expect to see those kind of levels build up. So if you see that, consider maybe a possibility of compaction.